Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. When you start a podcast, you want to break through, and we've been told that finding your niche is the way to do it. But sometimes your company speaks to a broad audience, so you have to find another way. Today, I'm talking to Christina Brady, the Chief Strategy Officer at Sales Assembly, who runs the Taking the Lead podcast, a podcast focused on highlighting the most accomplished, admired, and amazing female revenue leaders in B2B tech. Christina niched down in a different way. She didn't necessarily focus on the audience, although she is revenue in B2B tech, which is arguably niche already, but also found a niche with her guests, representing female revenue leaders, an already underserved group in a male-dominated industry. We'll dive into this and more. Enjoy the show. All right, so when you went to start this podcast, why did you choose to focus specifically on highlighting women in revenue?
Yeah, it's interesting because funny enough, the idea to have this be one of our outlets for highlighting women actually came from our CEO. We knew when I joined the company, as of right now, about a year and a half ago, we knew that we wanted to do something that highlighted women, multiple things that highlight women, whether it's, events or different platforms, just whatever it may be. We knew that there's a voice here that is missing. To be honest, there's a lot of voices that are missing in tech, but this is one that is like somewhat easy to tackle because it's a large part of the population. And so our CEO, Jeff, actually said, I think for some thought leadership, it would be pretty cool if we had a podcast. And what if the podcast is a female-focused podcast? And I was like, I love this. Let me go run with that. And he was like, yeah, that's my thought. Like, go run with that. Go do what you do. And so in my mind, it was kind of like piecing together the fact that, one, we didn't want to make a podcast that featured women that was only for women, because the whole idea is that some of these incredible female icons in tech are leading the way for the future, and their information and their expertise and their advice is relevant for everybody, not just for other women. So I knew the content needed to feature these incredible female leaders in tech, but I didn't want it to be only for their ears. I want it to be a podcast that anybody can listen to and get something out of. And so it was kind of about finding that balance of how do you highlight women without excluding every other gender. So that was sort of the balance that I played with before we launched it.
That's actually my next question. Was one of the things that I wanted to point out or call out is that this is not a podcast for women.
Right.
Your audience is revenue leaders. They can be male, female, anything in between. And it's just a podcast by women. Can you talk about how just because you're representing a specific segment with your guest, that the podcast audience or the podcast can be for anyone?
Yeah. The female experience in tech is everybody's experience in tech, and highlighting the positives of that is palpable for an audience of all genders. And also highlighting where it's not going so great and where there's some hurdles and some inequity and some inequality. That's also for all ears. On top of that, though, the podcast isn't really like those issues come up. We talk about some very, very personal things, but what we're talking about are more human issues. And if they lean toward the female lens, it's not only in a sense that it's for female ears, it's really for everybody to hear and listen to. Everybody knows another woman, and so it's like getting to know each other and sort of break down boundaries is what it's all about. But the second, call it 60% of every episode, is just focusing on something really, really tactical and hyper relevant to tech, and really giving a platform for these women to share their thought leadership where they may not have one. Like, there's a lot of brilliance that is happening behind the scenes in tech that can help everybody to level up. And so highlighting that and focusing on what knowledge do you have to share about your expertise in this area that everybody is going to benefit from. So first, tell us your story. How did you get here? What were the hardships along the way? What's a lesson to be learned? And then second, drop some knowledge. And like all of us have these questions, and I mean, the issues we face in tech when it comes down to the business is rarely split by gender. That is all the personal stuff. And so that's sort of where the balance is.
I find that really interesting, how you open the show, and how you just mentioned that, because usually I tell people to steer clear of the background questions, which
Yeah.
we didn't do today, obviously, and because it's kind of how I try to set up my shows. But but the counterpoint to that I also kind of preach is trying to start episodes with conflict or hardship. I recently had Meredith Metzger on here, and she talked about the inverted pyramid, which is, starting with the things that are most interesting first and background kind of conversation later. But I would say that any female leader in tech had to overcome, deal with conflict. So it's kind of interesting that your background questions really are questions and stories of overcoming. So can you talk to that a little bit? I find that fascinating.
Yeah, they're one and the same. I try to think about this podcast and any woman who listens to it that is feeling something similar and feels like they're alone or they don't know how to address it. Or they're wondering how to overcome this specific issue. There are women who have done those things, who have, climbed the ladder and dealt with all of, as we talked about, the inequity and the inequality. And unfortunately, right now, the female experience in tech is so tied to the business aspect of it. It's the personal portion of it. But by highlighting women, I also want this podcast to serve as sort of a guiding light for the women who are coming up. The women who are maybe sitting in an individual contributor seat and thinking, one day I want to be a VP, one day I want to be a CEO. Can I ever do that? How do I do that? Right? Myself, if I think about Christina 7 years ago, I started thinking about the fact that I knew I wanted to go into some sort of executive leadership. I knew I wanted to sit on the C suite one day, but I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know how. I didn't know what I was going to face along the way. I didn't know if there were any tips or tricks. You just don't know. And for most women, there's this sort of odd mix of mentorship and sponsorship where most female relationships with a female mentor, it gets stuck in mentorship, which is a great thing, but it's like, I'm going to help you personally be better, but the sponsorship lacks. Whereas when you see more male focused mentor relationships, there's the mentorship, I'm going to help you be better, but also the sponsorship. Hey, so-and-so hiring, look at the guy that I'm mentoring. He's amazing, and sponsoring them, helping them get that role. Women don't get that. Women don't feel that a lot. And so where are the opportunities to provide that knowledge of, like, you want to grow in your career, you want to get into tech, you want to be a leader, listen to these incredible women and how they did that. And one thing you'll notice, none of them are linear. None of them are. And that's okay. Nobody told me that 15 years ago, that it was okay to not have a linear career, especially as a woman. The idea of taking a step back in your career, whether that's title, whether that's pay, whether that's moving from a large, well-known company to a small company, it's terrifying because we're all worried that when we reach a certain level in our careers, we've become Icarus flying too close to the sun. We got too high, we got too good, we peaked out, and now come down and get back where you belong. By highlighting these stories, it helps women to take the chance and realize my nonlinear career is okay. And it actually might mean that I'm doing the right thing. And let me actually derive a tactical approach of how I can navigate my career by listening to these women sharing their stories. So in this case, it winds up being relevant. It's not like, oh, tell me about your childhood. Who are you? It's like, actually tell me about your childhood if it's relevant to how you got where you are right now, because other women need to know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious of one thing. What has it been like? A lot of this information is just so fascinating to me because I'm on the other side of it, where I've had mentors who are pushing me in this direction or that direction. I mean, I started a business with a guy who was my boss.
Yep.
We left and we started a business together because he did exactly what you said. He mentored me, he sponsored me. And when he went off to go start his next business, he brought me along with him. And for you, maybe it hasn't been the same way. And I remember one of your episodes, I forget the woman's name, but she worked at Glassdoor when you worked there and you were in the audience when she was speaking at Glassdoor maybe 7 years ago. You correct me if I'm wrong. And it was so awesome to see you connect with her as peers. When previously you'd been sitting in the audience and like looking up to her. So what has that been like for you when you historically have not had the ability maybe to connect with these other women because you're all so heads down, focused on trying to succeed yourself? that maybe you don't have enough time to lend a helping hand. And now you're in this position where you're getting to speak to all of these women. What has that been like for you?
It's been wild. Like, it's been buckle up. I mean, even recording that with, there's a lot of women that were at Glassdoor that I really looked up to during my time there who helped to kind of shape me into who I am and how I view things. I would not be in a position to do the job that I do without the mentorship and sponsorship of women like Stephanie Jenkins or like Kate Allering, who is the one that you mentioned in that episode. These women saw me and let me in the room. They let me sit at the table. Even when in most companies, they would say, well, this meeting has nothing to do with you. You don't need to be in here. When I would say, hey, I really want to be in that meeting. I know it has nothing to do with me, but I really want to learn what's going on in that meeting.
Yeah.
Well, because I sat in that meeting, now I'm able to say, actually, I know about that. I've done that. I built that. I sort of inserted myself. And there was an opportunity for me multiple times, even at my past job, where most people would say, you don't really need to be in this room. And then by being in the room and speaking up, suddenly I got involved in that project that had nothing to do with what I was doing. And now I have that expertise. So going from being somebody who is learning and looking up to these women who, again, I keep saying the word iconic, but like they were iconic to me, to think of myself as a peer, it's really difficult. It's like when you see one of your grade school teachers on the street, you're like, Miss Smith. And she's like, you can call me Jamie now, like we're adults. And I was like, no.
No way.
You're my teacher. I can't call you that. And like, don't worry, I've been good, right? It's that thought where it's like, to me, the people who are your icons that you look up to always are.
Mhm.
So instead for me, it's how can I be that for somebody else? Like I say a lot that time is the most precious asset in the world that you never get back. And people choosing to spend that with you, probably one of the biggest gifts ever, and don't abuse that. And so for me, it's if I'm going to spend time with somebody, I want someone to look back on their time with me and say, that was a really good use of that little chunk of my life. So now it's like, I don't think that I will ever in my mind aspire to some of these incredible women, but it's like, I can try to be that for somebody else.
Well, I am sure that will be the case, that you'll be that for someone else. And I think you might be selling yourself a little bit short, that you won't be up to their level, but that's okay. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was that your show does extremely well for B2B standards, right? We don't have the same types of audience size that maybe, entertainment shows or things like that, for the most part, outside of a select few. And then you're a B2B revenue show at that, which there is no shortage of people in sales or marketing or revenue in general that are trying to create podcasts. So how do you think that focusing specifically on highlighting women has helped your show to break through in a very saturated landscape of B2B shows?
I think it's helping to create and feed the appetite of wanting there to be variation. Variation doesn't mean that a cis white male in tech isn't welcome. It means we want variation. We want that. And then other cultures, other races, other genders, other professional journeys to also be a part of the story so that when you're going to learn how to interact professionally in tech or uplevel your career or get advice, you have the opportunity to hear that from a myriad of different people who can help you to really broaden your scope and your horizon, which is going to make you a better professional.
Mm-hmm.
So I think by simply being one of those differentiating factors, what we're not aiming to do is drown out the voices of anybody who isn't. What we're trying to do is add to it. Here's another flavor. Take a look. And anytime something brand new comes out or it's a different flavor, it's instantly attractive, right? Like even if it's super gross, like I think about Starbucks, which I love Starbucks, but every year they come out with like sort of this like brand new drink. And sometimes they sound super gross, but you're like, I'm going to try it. It's brand new. Let's just see how it is. Like it's a different take. In terms of highlighting women in tech, that hasn't always been really popular. And at some companies, it's still not. The majority of board seats are all men. And they say they love women, they want to promote them, but they're not showing it with their board seats. They're not showing it with their executive leadership. And so I would go so far as to say that we love to say, oh, yeah, we're all about women, but prove it. And so this is something that is out there that is highlighting women leaders and showing everybody that equality and variation in the voices that are leaders in this industry is going to change, and it needs to change. And again, not replace, I'm not saying replace, I'm saying change, add to. It's not a pie. There's not limited pieces.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to another thing, which is something that we hear a lot about at Motion, is people's ability to book guests, and that it takes time and, what have you. and your guests are amazing. I mean, I literally cried when I sat in on the Allison Haddad episode. I mean, I had to be off camera. I was
She's
sitting in as a
amazing.
producer, and I was just like, I'm really glad I'm not on camera right now.
Almost didn't make it through that one too.
I know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you are getting just absolutely phenomenal guests, which are a sub segment. I mean, most shows that I oversee don't have any sort of, requirement such as, other than if people being in your space, so you're getting people in your space, you're getting women in tech and revenue. So, I mean, we're going like, if we're putting filters on, we're filtering down, but you continue to uncover incredible guest after incredible guest. So can you just tell me and the audience a little bit about your approach to finding these amazing guests?
Yeah. I mean, luckily I have folks on my team who are kind of helping me. So we have some of our people on our team where I'm like, if there is a female VP and above working in B2B tech anywhere, I need to know who they are, not just for the podcast, but just because that's how we build community, where I want to find my other female tech revenue leaders. So a lot of LinkedIn hunting, a lot of referrals. I actually have a lot of women who inbound who are either like, I'm a revenue leader in tech, I would love to talk to you. Or they say, hey, my boss is incredible. Like that level of sponsorship is what I preach. And what makes me the happiest is when an individual contributor, like an account executive or a CSM who comes across the podcast and they hear it, they'll email me out of the blue and say, I listen to your podcast. It's incredible. My VP at my company is amazing. She would be so good on your show. And I was like, I would love to meet her. And so I love, again, that's the sponsorship, right? Of women who are lifting others up where they're like, I'm recognizing her brilliance. She should be on your show. So it's a combination of me finding women, looking a little bit at kind of their history, what they've done. And the more unique the background for them, the better. Like if you look at my guests, they all, again, have this very non-linear path where they're in tech and out of tech, and they're over in new business and then in growth and then in operations and in marketing. And it's like, I just love these complex stories. And so, I mean, I'll just cold outreach women too. Like I'll see them on LinkedIn and be like, oh my gosh, like, look at what you've done. And I start to get really curious about like, how did you get there? Why did you make that move? Like, that is really interesting. And then I'll just reach out and say, you don't know me. I'm not that much of a creep. I was looking at your LinkedIn and I love your story. And I would just love to talk to you and meet you and get to know you. And then we get on a call and it's this very awkward at first. Like we're both sitting there. She's like, so what does this girl want? And I was like, I love your story. I don't know if you know, I have a podcast. I feature like the female tech icons. And I love your story and I would love for you to come on the show. And it's just this moment where they're like, they weren't expecting that, and then they're like, oh, I mean, yeah, like, and I was like, have you ever spoken before? Like, has anybody ever heard your ideas? And it's just about getting them excited about speaking. And then I hope that I plant a bug in each of them and plant the bug of like, don't let this be the last time that you share your story and share your journey. Like this should be the start if you've never done that before, because I mean, to your point, I agree. I have these incredible guests and some of them, this is the first time they've ever spoken outside the four walls of their company. And it's crazy to me where I'm like, people can learn from you. So that's kind of where I find them. It's a little bit all over the place. People get a lot of outreach from me randomly on LinkedIn.
And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this, but for me, so when we first started podcasting, it was basically any VP of marketing, CMO, you can be a director of marketing, and basically loosely tied to B2B tech. And that is a huge pond. And I actually found it harder then than I do now, which is the people who I have on this show are people who are associated with B2B tech still. They're in marketing, but they're on a small marketing team and they have an interest in or doing something with podcasting. And I actually find it easier now having a smaller pond per se, but to have those conversations where when I reach out to someone, and you're not the best example, Christina, because we know each other, but when I reach out to someone, okay, let's use Meredith Metzger. I'm not sure if you know her, but she's a recent episode that we had. She runs Stonely's podcast. She is you should have her on your show, actually, Christina. She is a freaking rock star. She's one of the most impressive people in podcasting that I've met. I mean, she runs the show in terms of she's the host. She writes all of her own questions, and then she does all of the post-production work in terms of making video, audio.
Wow.
She does everything. Anyway, so I had her on the show, and it was such an easy outreach because I reached out to her and I'm like, hey, I've been watching what you're doing. I know you create all of your own content. I'm seeing the podcast that you put out. And so what's her response back to me? Like, of course, I would love to talk
Yeah.
about being on your show. It actually makes sense to me because your outreach was very targeted, which I don't think is very eye opening, but something I hear a lot of is people want to stay very broad. And I personally feel like the more broad you are, the more difficult those conversations are. So what are your thoughts on the ability to have conversations with folks when you have a more narrow, a narrow guest profile?
Yeah. It's what I found is there's a lot more women revenue tech leaders than I thought, which was nice. Um, it reminded me that they're out there. They just don't have a platform and they are there. What actually has wound up being interesting is always finding somebody and then finding a topic that is going to be enough of a differentiator from what we've discussed before, but also highlight what they're really, really great at. And so finding the guest, at least so far, there's plenty of women out there. There's women I haven't even met with and connected with, probably thousands upon thousands, who are the ideal guest for this show. So the only limitation is my ability to find them and then find the time to record amongst all of the scheduling and get it done. It's like, that's more so the hurdle. Is like, you're
Yeah.
there. We just got to get you in here. And then the other is, how do we find something to talk about that is well within their area of expertise? But the other thing is that there's a finite amount of buckets of areas that you can focus on when it comes to tech from a tactical standpoint, right? Before you start being like, well, we covered that in one episode and now here's a different flavor. It's like, I want to hit all of the buckets before we start doing a little bit of the repeats or something. It's like, oh yeah, well, episode 6 is like pretty similar to episode 22 is like kind of the same thing. Like, I want there to be a differentiator, not just because I want the show to be interesting, but because I really want every woman on it to feel like they're highlighted. And not be like, oh, that episode sounded kind of like that other one. It's like, I need each of them to sort of stand out on their own. That's the part that gets a little bit difficult. Not impossible, but it's thinking about like, how does this episode stand alone? And if this is the only episode that we had on the entire show, would people say that this was a good use of time versus like, no episode can and should be a throwaway episode. And like every TV series has that. A lot of podcasts have that where you're listening and you're like, oh, okay, it was all right. It's like, no, I need all of them. And so it's that pressure, right? It's that pressure of doing this incredible woman justice. That's the part that makes me nervous.
Yeah. And a couple of things on that. One is that I'm sure you would talk to many people, or at least I would, who would think that having, a segmented guest profile would be impossible, or niching down or anything like that would make it can't happen. And it's ironic, or what have you. You've experienced the same thing that I have, which is as we did go levels deeper, and my show, is very specific in the people that we bring on and our audience and the guest profiles. It's still a huge font, and we don't struggle to find guests. And it's just a matter of having some things in place, like having other people tell you, hey, if you talk to someone in podcasting, make sure to send them my way, get referrals, inbound type things like that. And then the other thing that you mentioned is just, how every story matters so much. And I think it is easier to make every story matter when you have a very well articulated theme to your show, where it's like every episode you go in, who you're helping, how you're helping them, who that guest profile is. And when you have those things so well identified, I think it does make it easier to not have throwaway episodes.
Definitely. And then that actually brings up another point that's kind of difficult, which is, sometimes I meet women who wind up not being a great fit for the show because it is so specific. We want to be in one lane so that when people listen to this show, one, they identify this is relevant for me. And then when they listen, they're like, well, that was hyper relevant to what I'm doing every single day. Like that is also important is knowing that we're in a niche, but doing that niche really, really well. I'll either have women who inbound me or that I'm introduced to who are like, oh, I'd love to be on the show. And after talking to them and hearing them, they're not in the B2B tech space. They never have been. Like I get a lot of women who, like I had one woman who was incredible, but she's like, oh, I'm a children's book author. I would love to come on the show. And I'm like, I would love to talk to you, but this is like, this is not the show. Like, this isn't a show that is just about like, let me talk to anybody. I was like, this show is a very, very tactical B2B tech focused show. Like, we are talking about that. We are knee deep in it, nerding out. And so that's also kind of difficult though, is when you have women who you can tell want to have more exposure. And in those cases, if I know somebody who's doing a show that I can introduce them to, I'll do that. But it's difficult when you have people who you have to kind of say like, well, this isn't, or I'll have somebody who has been doing insurance sales for a really long time. They're like, I've been in sales forever. I would love to talk about it. I started my own practice and what that was like. And I'm like, that is all amazing, but it's not the fit for the show. And so like like saying no to people has been really, really hard.
But it's so important, and I'll explain why to the audience, is because if we go back to the fact that a B2B show is not going to get your thousands of downloads. If you use Buzzsprout statistics, I'm actually going to pull them up right now and read them off for the audience. If you're getting 87 downloads an episode for your podcast, that puts you in the top 25% of all podcasts in Buzzsprout, which is a hosting platform that hosts over 105,000 podcasts. So we're not talking about a small pond here. So out of 105,000 podcasts, if you're getting 87 downloads an episode in your first 7 days, you're in the top 25% globally of podcasts. And if you have these throwaway episodes where you are doing something as a favor to a person, you're selling yourself short, because if you're in the top 25% globally, not you, Christina, I'm just using this as a hypothetical. If you're the top 25% globally, and so you have 87 people who are tuning in per episode, and then they tune in and they're expecting to hear the content that they've been coming for the previous episodes. Let's say maybe they've only listened to 3 and they're just starting to get, that kind of loyalty that you want from your listeners. And then you have an episode that is completely has nothing to do with what they were expecting. Well, there's no shortage of B2B shows and revenue. So what's Christina's audience going to go do? They're going to go find another show. And there is no guarantee that they ever come back. And so you just lost, if you lost 5 out of 87, I mean, that is a substantial chunk percentage of your listener base. So it is so important that every episode you come in and you think about, who is my audience? What is the theme of my show? And does this fit in specifically? And I'll give an example on my side, which was we use this a story brand consultant to help us to launch our website about a year ago. And he helped a lot, helped us to come up with our brand message and brand story and how we speak to people. And he asked me if he could come on our show. And I like this guy and I want him to succeed. And I had to do the same thing. I had to say, no, I can't have you on the show. And it is not because I don't like you. It's not that I don't think that you would come on and give someone valuable advice, but you don't have a podcast. Do you help people with messaging? Do you help people all over the place in marketing and sales? Absolutely. But that's not what the show's about. And so unfortunately, I had to say, you can't come on. And it sucked. It wasn't fun to do that. I like the guy,
Yeah. I mean, what you talk about, it reminds me like if you think about reality shows back in like early to mid 2000s when they were booming, there was this thing that they always did where in the middle or sometime randomly intermixed in every season, they would have one episode that instead of advancing the story forward, it was like, we're going to be here with all of them and we're going to think back on like our top 5 favorite moments of the season. And they stopped doing that because it tanked their viewership so aggressively. It ticked people off because they tune in for the next episode thinking we're going to find out what happens next. And instead, you have the entire cast talking about the episodes you've already seen. And they quickly stopped doing that. Like reality shows today don't do that anymore because of the fact that when there was that kind of throwaway episode, it turned people off so aggressively. And so it's a good point to make. Doesn't mean that it's not painful to have to turn people away who want to be on it. Because again, it's like on the one hand, my mission is to elevate like the female voices of the world. Absolutely. The female voices in tech, very much so. And then when you come across that where it's like it's checking one box, but it's not checking the other box, it's hard. You don't like rejecting anybody.
It's interesting. And what they do now in reality TV is actually now the last episode of the season.
The last episode.
And so it's like, you've already gotten all the content, you know, the entire story.
Yep.
And now what it is a bonus. So actually this got me thinking, Christina, like I would say if you're going to do that and you're going to have someone outside of the niche of your show, is you provide it as like a bonus episode.
Yes.
So like if you release on Tuesdays, maybe you do a release on a Thursday, and make sure that you inform your audience, hey, I want you to know this is a bonus episode. We're going a little bit outside, like do an intro to the show and say, we're going a little bit outside of what we normally do. We thought this would be an interesting story. We'll be back every Tuesday with, you know, exactly what you come to tune in for, but it's bonus material. And that's what those reality shows are doing now, so that they don't tank their viewership. Is like, hey, you've gotten it all. And instead of us having the season finale be the season finale, we're going to give you the, whatever they call it.
The reunion.
The reunion. Exactly. The reunion special. We're going to bring everybody in and they're going to talk about it. And then you don't feel like you tuned in for no reason. You feel like you're actually getting more than what you set out for. So, all right, I want to pivot a little bit. So let's talk about the actual content, right? So you're not a huge internal marketing team. You're my favorite kind of small and scrappy. So how has the podcast helped Sales Assembly on the thought leadership side and content front?
It gives us an outlet for it. And it gives us an outlet in the way that people absorb content, because you've got two things when you have to think about marketing any kind of thought leadership. And one is, what is the material itself? Is it good material that is helpful and consistently so? Is it material that builds upon itself, or is it stale? Like, is it relevant? And then you also have, how are people wanting to actually interact with this? How are people wanting to digest this content? And if you don't have a good balance between the two, then you could have really good content that nobody sees, right? Like building a beautiful house in the middle of the woods, and nobody sees that, right? Or you have really cruddy content and you pour a lot of money into getting it in front of people, and then it actually deteriorates your brand as a company, because you are putting out material that you are forcibly having people digest that isn't great material, or it's fluffy, or there's nothing revolutionary about it. Like, I will see in my feed some of the stories that I can tell have a paid marketing push behind them. And I read the article and it almost upsets me, because I'm like, you know, this was pushed in front of me. It was told that it was relevant to me, and I'm reading it. And this is either really 1.0 information, or I completely disagree with it, or it is stale and not relevant anymore. And now I look at who the author of that thought leadership is, and that deteriorates their brand in my mind. So there's all these things that you have to think about. And a podcast is a great way to do something where people have a means to digest the content, right? Like, people have Spotify on their phones. They have Pandora on their phones. Now people are starting to get out and drive again and go to the office. And it's, I can listen to my music, or I can like throw in my favorite podcast and listen to a story, get inspired. People like that. They want to listen, and it's on their own terms, right? It's not a matter of, hey, this is airing one time at this time, and if you're not there to listen to it, you're going to miss that. It is there when I want it and when I need it. There's something attractive about that. So the piece in terms of having a podcast as one of your elements for thought leadership is an incredible way to do that. You're meeting people where they are. Then it's just making sure that the content is really good and relevant and hyper relevant to the when. And that kind of brings me to making sure that you're not also recording episodes and then, you know, publishing them 6 months later, where everything we said in the episode we recorded is no longer relevant. You know, like 2020, first launching this podcast, my God, you and I talked about how we had to be careful with that, right? It was like, if you're recording somebody in, you know, July of 2020, and then we don't air this until January of 2021, we now know totally different world that we're living in. And so if I'm listening to that, it's like, oh God, when did they record this? You never want someone to think that. So it's like the relevancy. And if you know you're going to have a long leash of, like, if you know, like, I'm going to record this and it's going to be 3 months from now, and some of our episodes were that, I had to make a note to make sure that nothing was super specific, right? Like, don't talk about this month and what's happening, because people are going to digest this content. Like, right now it's August. They're going to digest this content in October. So let's keep that in mind. So that's another piece of it, is making sure when they listen to it, they're not like, oh, is this the most recent episode? Like, you don't want that.
As a podcaster who believed in getting ahead by recording shows and having them, you know, just being able to have my content library ready to go, as a podcaster who started in 2019 and went through the pandemic, let me tell you about recording too far in advance.
Oh my God.
We probably flushed 20 episodes. I had to reach out.
Yeah.
I in late 2019, I did an entire like mini series around conference based marketing.
No. Oh no.
That was set to release in like
February to May. And if
Perfect.
anyone remembers what happened in February to May of 2020, let me tell you, you want to make sure that you dump. So I tell people like 60 to 90 days. Any longer than that, especially in this global environment, you are playing with fire because you may say
Yeah.
something that is completely irrelevant, inappropriate. I mean, can you imagine if I'm publishing conference-based episodes as every company is shutting down office space, shutting down every conference, or trying to recoup money? And I bring someone on to talk about like, yeah, we go to these conferences. It's where we get the majority of our leads every year. So anyway, yeah, just be careful with recording too far out in front. I mean, preparation is a good thing when it comes to marketing,
Yeah.
like over preparing, you might put yourself in a bind. And something that you talked about, Christina, was, just the ability to get out and put this content in front of people. So regarding distribution, look, you have a great following on LinkedIn and you do a phenomenal job there. And so I just wanted to know, what is your approach for distributing your podcast content on LinkedIn and social media?
I mean, it's pretty basic. Like we are lucky that we have you all and your team kind of behind us producing the podcast, putting together some of the blog posts that you do. So it gives us really good content to be able to share. So the first thing that I will say is having that level of support means that my entire focus is recording good content and then releasing it and not ensuring that that good content actually reads well. And it sounds like a setup that I'm saying that it's not. It is actually very important to have a partner in this while you're building it because there's a lot to focus on to do really, really well. So that's the first thing is I know when we have an episode released that it's going to be good. It's going to sound good. It's going to have good highlights in it. Like I just know like, okay, this is going to be an asset that's ready to go. Then it's just really, really simple. So we have them on all of the different streaming platforms that they could possibly be on. So one there is just like wherever people are going on their phones or their computers to listen to podcasts, like we have to make sure that we are there. So that's step one is it there? Is it available? Step two is every time we have a new episode, I put a post up on LinkedIn. I tag the people who are in it. I try to highlight some of what's in the episode, but also make it a little bit of a teaser. Like we talked about this, listen to hear more. So I try to make it a commercial or a trailer versus a total giveaway. And then we also have, links to it on our website and we talk about it and reference it pretty frequently. And so it's really just talking about it word of mouth. I mean, to this date, we haven't even really done any kind of like paid marketing or advertising behind it. And I think the last time I checked, our average downloads across all episodes is like 115.
Which
So,
if we go back to
yeah,
those podcast statistics, puts you probably in the top 20% of
yeah,
shows worldwide. So it's
yeah.
important because I think that people don't really understand what download numbers mean. And so it is good to set those expectations. So sorry for interrupting.
No, that was a good interrupt. And so like that's, and part of what you and I talk about is I want to get this in the hands of more people. Not from an egotistical standpoint. It's actually for me. I mean, I try very much in my episodes to take a back seat to the guest and truly highlight that. Like my show is about them and their story. And when I have a guest on somebody else's podcast, that's my time for my story. But my show is about my guest. And my promise to them is like, I'm giving you a platform and I want to do everything I can to get this thought leadership out into the world. And so and something that we're always thinking about is how do we get more ears on this and sort of spread some of this knowledge around?
All right. And I know you want to highlight your guest, but I want to talk about Christina Brady for 1 second. So LinkedIn
Okay.
is great, right? It can be this thing that you use in your career to stand out from the crowd. If you have this big following, I hope you retire at sales assembly or have whatever happens for you want to have happen. But in reality, most people, wherever they are today, whether it's me or you or anybody, are not going to end their career at the company they're currently at based on
Right.
statistics. In my selfish opinion, I think that a podcast takes that kind of, if having a LinkedIn is good, having a podcast is great, in my opinion, because anyone can have a LinkedIn. I think that's a great first step. But staying
Yeah.
consistent with a podcast shows dedication to a craft and the ability to defy odds because most podcasts fail. So I am just curious, what long-term impact do you think that running this podcast will have on your career?
I hope that people are surprised by the traction that it receives. And when I say people, I mean, I am and I was. I didn't know starting this out if it was going to pick up. I didn't know if I was going to look at the analytics and see, 2 or 3 people have listened to it every week. And that's like, me and somebody else at my company. Like, are we just creating this content in a bubble? And seeing the reaction of some of the folks who are listening to the episodes and how it's kind of connecting, it's surprised me. The long-term effectiveness, I want it to be one, to highlight more diversity because there's appetite for it. So this is the time. If you are going to start highlighting diversity, I mean women, but I also mean BIPOC. I also mean LGBTQIA. I mean, any voices in tech that don't currently have that stage. If anything, this is proving that there's an appetite for that. I want this to be a catalyst to that change. And I also want the long tail effect to be that women feel comfortable sharing their stories. They feel comfortable talking about what went well and what doesn't. And they actually feel comfortable being confident and being known for knowing what they're doing. This idea of women needing to have modesty and very, very low ego is to not ruffle any feathers. I'm going to shake that up. I want there to be a microphone that extends far beyond this podcast. And maybe this podcast is one of the first examples that, yeah, there's something here. There's a catalyst to this. Like, if it's just that, if it's just a fire starter, I'm happy with that. If it's much more, I would be happy with that too.
And that really leads me in. This is my last question. We spoke a few days ago and you were talking about how it's budget season. And when the podcast came up in those conversations, for you, it wasn't even a conversation to be had because it means so much to you. So if you had to put it into words, what does taking the lead mean to you?
Oh, man. I mean, it's my way of putting my money where my mouth is. There's a lot of conversation right now in terms of gender injustice and racial injustice and inequality. And there's a lot of companies out there that talk a lot about how much they're doing to help with that. And I think that their intentions are very, very good. They always are. But then how do we actually make a difference in this area is actually really, really complicated for a lot of companies, but it's actually not complicated for us. We had an ability and a runway to do something meaningful in this area and elevate a diverse voice without having to cut through a lot of red tape, without having to go through a lot of approvals, without rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. Taking advantage of that kind of gift that we have, that myself and my company are in a position to be able to actually act on real change. I've been at companies before that are very, very well intentioned and want to do that, but honestly, finding a way how and changing is like trying to move a mountain. And it's a lot of good intentions that fall to frustrations and feeling like there's an inability to change. Actually having the ability to do something like this and make this change and cause this ripple, that's a little bit of the dream for somebody like me that just, I want to do some good in the world. I've been through too much to not. Like, what is my legacy going to be? Hopefully helping other people to step into their light. That's it. This is one of my opportunities to do that. So yeah, when it came up of like, what do you do with the podcast? And I was like, we obviously keep the podcast. This is one of our areas. We can do that. It wasn't a question to anybody. Everybody was like, we got to keep the podcast going. So it was a no-brainer.
That's amazing. Yeah. There's something to be said about, the amount of people out there who talk about change and then the folks who actually do something about it. And, what you did was started a podcast where you're very specific in the people that you highlight and you give them a voice. And I love that about your show. So we're coming up on time. So I want people to know where they can go to learn more about you, what you're doing at Sales Assembly, and also with Taking the Lead.
Yeah. Well, first thing I'm going to say is check out the podcast. Taking the Lead. You find it anywhere that you can stream your favorite shows. It's a big picture of me, looking very professional with my arms crossed, and like that's sort of the graphics. So you can actually hear the show and digest the content there. I'm on LinkedIn, Christina Brady. I'm the only one with really bright red hair, so you can very easily find me. And then my email, I'm welcoming all of you to reach out, Christina@salesassembly.com. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the company, and part of my job is to build the product and make it meaningful for tech, but also keep all of these things in mind. So that's what I'm doing.
Well, Christina, thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on with me today. It was wonderful having you on Recorded Content.
Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I appreciate you as always.